it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Mrs. Creeds did not kill her husband. Mrs. Creeds was a lot of things. She was a liar, she was a witch, and she was certainly up to something. But Mrs. Creeds did not kill her husband. When I arrived into town, the first thing I noticed was the colour. There was a grey, shallow mist hanging limply in the air. It left everything with a mild hue. At a glance, one might mistake it for dusk, but closer inspection would prove otherwise. The setting sun would cascade a warm light, giving the world a final embrace before descending into slumber. There was no warmth in this mist. Heavy, palpable, carrying with it an odour. The streets were so barren it was rather a surprise to see a mother holler out to a few young children playing along the path our carriage was treading. Their activities came to a halt as they stared dumbly over at us, before it dawned on them to run out of our way. With them gone, my attention turned upward. Although it was not my destination, at least not in the present time, I could not help but stare. The Creeds' manor. It had been built along a hilltop, standing tall and jagged, every curtain drawn so not a drop of light exceeded past it, giving it the illusion that it was a black, inky blot along the sky. As the noon sun continued its journey, it lowered more and more behind the house. The idea that the house itself was swallowing the sun crossed my mind. I realized how ridiculous the imagery seemed, but there was an energy around which was difficult to be described. As if the land's only purpose was to have been created for this one house, and now the town's only purpose was to aid in this charade. I arrived at my destination, paid my tab for the ride, and then turned to knock on the door. A man in his mid-20s opened, the scent of the town dissipating with that of tobacco and whiskey. I saw his forehead before his face as he stared at his shoes while opening, both hands against either side of the doorframe, balancing himself. When he looked up at me, the man went from tired to dishevelled. I knew this reaction had very little to do with my arrival. "Can I, help you?" "I'm here for the case. You wrote to me." He nodded and cleared his throat in a hurried manner. He brushed off his clothes and stood up straight. "Oh, thank you for your time, Mr." Yes, Mr. is fine," I answered shortly. This caught him off guard. There was a pause before he added, "That's not what I know what you meant, but we may as well get assumptions out of the way, just as I assume you meant for my surname. Shadows." "Shadows, very well, very well." He took out a cigar, made an offer to me, as though by means of apology, but I promptly declined. He then led me down the foyer into the sitting room. I placed my coat and hat on a hanger in the corner before taking a seat opposite his desk, making myself comfortable. He scrambled through a number of papers, searching without purpose, before wandering behind me to inspect the dresser. It was then I noticed that I had been seated in the center of the room. Even when he returned to my line of sight, my back felt very exposed. Finally, he began his pitch. The Creeds family is an odd one of sorts." "Odd how?" I thought about that tall, inky house which seemed to eat the sun. I knew I should get the whole story before making conclusions. That was my job, after all. I know more than most how shallow it is to judge solely on appearance. He pulled the cigar out of his mouth and exhaled, smoke filling the small room, and I stifled back a cough. He then waved it around as he paced, creating a trail. They've always been the landlords. This is their land. Several centuries now they've owned all of this, and yet... A long drag. No one can ever recall seeing any member of this family, except the spouses who are imported. Imported? They claim it's for class. Nobles marrying other nobles, you see. And you don't believe this? He shook his head, snuffing out his cigar and taking a seat at his desk. Well, it's not as though we're lacking in other well-off families, and even so, They're closer neighbours, but this family, they import from whole other countries. I nod, taking a mental note. It was hardly an unusual tactic, though, still worth recognition. That wasn't the centre of my concentration, however. What more can you tell me about the spouses? He shrugged. Usually wives, occasionally husbands. We send in the money, they send out the letters, and when their heir marries, there's suddenly a spouse who goes around town and makes public appearances. No one's ever seen the blood-borne creeds. Well, that's how they've always been. He stood back up, opened a drawer in his desk, and poured out a flask. And then he took a long swig. Sorry, he said, though his tone was bold. Can I ask about the eyes? I gestured towards my face. I've learned to expect the question. After all, bright marigold was hardly a common colour. It was very difficult to miss. Genetics, born with them. Doctors say there's nothing to be done, but also no harm in keeping them. He nodded, poking at the inside of his cheek, as if holding back the urge to press on. In your letter you mentioned that you suspected foul play. Can you elaborate? I asked, attempting to get back on the subject. He made a sound of agreement, hurriedly placing a hand to his mouth in order to prevent a dribble of alcohol from escaping his lips. His swallow could be heard from across the room, and his flask hit the desk. Only 4 months ago was the latest heir married. His blushing bride came in by boat, was delivered to this house, and that was it. And now he's dead. Just as quickly as he'd placed the flask back down, he picked it back up. And this is cause of suspect, I pressed on, worried that I might be losing him. Why, it's rather odd timing, don't you find? Well, it's difficult to find anything odd in particular with a family no one seems to know anything about. Something of a chuckle came from him, though I found little humour in the situation. He'd been much more direct in his letter. I didn't understand why he was so distracted at present. She had everything to gain, the stocks, the manor, the entire town. I then went on to question him in regards to her character, and he proceeded to tell me that she was a lovely woman, physically and beyond, very patient and quiet. She'd stop by about once a month or so to go over details of their estate, their insurance, and of course the late Mr. Creed's will. Whenever he asked about the health of her husband, she'd always reply with a sigh and a glittering twinkle in her eye before reporting that all was well. Even the day before he died, that was always her response, her one response. And the husband's autopsy? What did the pathologist say? He shook his head. Oh, there was no autopsy, not public at any rate. They use a family doctor then, or are they imported too? He held up a finger as if suddenly being struck with a memory. Placing down his flask, he scrambled through the many papers across his desk before pulling one up. He handed it over, and after a brief inspection, it became clear that I was holding a medical exam. This is what she presented to me, he said, as if that alone was explanation. It was how I became aware of his death, you see. Here she came, all dressed in black, and handed me that medical exam. She announced, "He's dead," and then strode away. I made a sound in acknowledgement, reading over the paper. Now, I must confess that I'm no doctor, and I didn't wholly understand what it all meant, but it was a clue. Are you implying that she performed the autopsy herself? Wouldn't surprise me, he stated. Well, that family, with its secrets, I request annual medical exams for their life insurance, you see. From what I know, they either train their heirs in the ways of medicine or marry into it. The latest mistress hasn't been around long enough for me to determine which. Is it safe to assume that it was a private funeral? Only next of kin? Next of kin? His response was as if I'd just announced a punchline. There is no one else in that manner. For generations, the Creeds have had one heir and one alone. Then, when that child has come of age and married, the parents are never heard from again. And yes, I can see what you want to ask. That is cause for suspicion, and you'd not be the first detective to think so. But no one in all this time has found reasonable cause for doubt. Which is why this stands out even more, don't you see? Well, at his excitement, he began to pace again, only looking at me occasionally. He circled around the chair I sat in, and I became aware of how often he was behind me. For the first time in generations, an heir is recently married, and then deceased, all before another heir has been born to take his place. I nodded. No family doctor, no next of kin, no servants? No servants. I see. I stood up, making to grab my coat and hat. Oh, good day then. He scrambled to follow me to the door. Well then, you understand what it is I'm asking of you? I understand. So off I was, to the Creed's manor. I did not hail for a cab this time. I doubted I could catch one, but more than that, I wanted to gain a better inspection of the town, while thinking over my tactics and the information I'd been given. The husband and wife, alone in a giant manor, with all the power and money to control a town. It was difficult to look at those facts with an unbiased opinion, but they were, at the end of the day, circumstantial. I couldn't let circumstances cloud my judgment again. I knew all too well the consequences of that. Oh, even now I can still hear her. No, I cannot think like that. New life, new me. I'll solve this case. That is, if there's a case to be solved. But it occurred to me then, did the town know what was going on? Were they aware that their landlord was now deceased? Did the family's attorney have any reason to make this knowledge public? Did they understand who I was and why I had arrived? At this moment I realized how close to the manor I'd become. It seemed to loom over as I approached, staring down at me. I recalled a time in my youth when I'd been camping and had spent a morning washing my face in the nearby swamp. Upon wiping the waters off of my brow, I became aware of another presence. A pile of rocks in the distance began to float in my direction, until I saw an alligator. Well, simple surroundings, maybe not the best of times, but certainly humble, suddenly made menacing by just the addition of a vicious predator. Well, I still think of it to this day, what might have happened if I hadn't seen the truth sooner. Well, the closer I reached the manor, the more its inky blackness began to take form, till I could see every crack in the windows, every moss in the bricks. This shallow form which towered over the town and ate its sunlight was nothing more than a house. Its door stood high above me, ornate patterns faded to time, now only emphasizing the lack of care over the years. I knocked. Mrs. Creed's opened up to me. Part 2. Mrs. Creed's had Eastern features, with high cheekbones and jet black hair, which at some point had been tied back in an elaborate style, but now hung in strands around her shoulders. The bodice she wore also contained loose ties, and the skirt of her dress was wrinkled and worn at the edges. Her lips dry and cracked, she leaned forward with her hands still clutching onto the door handles, as if standing up directly was too difficult, and she was in the need of support for balance. Her eyes hung heavy, opening slowly as she peered up at me. "Who are you?" was the question I believe she meant to ask. However, her voice came out so quietly, the final word was the only one I heard. "Detective Shadows. I'm here on behalf of your attorney." She inhaled deeply, holding it in a few moments before allowing it to release, her collarbone made visible with the action. She did not meet my gaze again as her head bobbled up and down, and she finally let go of the handle. Her arm ventured out in what I assumed was a type of point, and I took hold of her, allowing her to steady onto me and lead us into the direction she gestured. We sat down in the dining room, a table stretched out, empty and leering with the candelabra between us giving off very limited light, making it seem endless. I sat her down at one end and placed myself directly opposite. "Now then," I started. "I don't want to take up too much of your time, so let's get right to business." She nodded before producing a handkerchief and wiping away at her eyes. I hadn't noticed the tears and wondered if they were really there. I don't know what more I could possibly say," she began. "It's a family disease." How convenient. I remained silent as a means to urge her to go on. I always knew about it, but that does not make it any easier. She dabbed again at her eyes. "He was always so kind, you know. Such a kind soul." "I understand," I said, keeping my tone calm and quiet. "How long were the two of you married?" "A year." The first slip. I feigned a look of surprise. "Excuse me, madam, but your attorney, he says you've only arrived just 4 months ago." Her face lit up at that, more alert. The tiniest glint of a frown hovered above her brow. It was obvious she was beginning to suspect my reason for being there. "Sir," she started, slowly and deliberately, "I arrived 4 months ago, yes, but my late husband pursued me long before that. The Creed's family does not marry at random." This time she sat up and dragged her fingers through her hair, as if finally aware of how disheveled her appearance was. "It takes a certain type of person to be married into this family." I began to see who this woman was, who she might still be. It would take more than grieving, false or real, to erase the generations' worth of pride instilled in a wealthy bloodline like this. "And you fit that qualification." I wanted to ask if medical expertise had been a part of that, but she answered me all too quickly. "Well, naturally." Her eyes darted, and I felt a twinge of hesitance then. We were legally married overseas in my own country. He returned to attend to his affairs, and I came along afterward. I nodded. Well, it would be impossible to confirm with anyone else in the village. Was it a small ceremony, or did you have a wedding? The tongue poked through, and she ran it across her lower lip, no longer maintaining eye contact with me. She sighed deeply. "It was a wedding." Her hands clenched the handkerchief. She gazed out across the room, but she wasn't looking at her house. She saw this memory play out before her. I knew he didn't want one, but then he insisted. He knew how much I wanted it. Oh, he was so thoughtful. She burst into tears. "Well, I've seen many liars in my day. Once I questioned a woman claiming her child had drowned in the pond, all while her own feet and hands were still caked with mud. The tragedy of the situation, how they were taken too soon, it wasn't fair, could not be real. People who cry their hearts out over the death of a loved one only to turn bone dry when the life insurance pays out. But would a liar understand the nuance of crying at a happy memory? It was at that moment when I peered around. This wasn't the first manor I'd ever been in, but the proportions seemed off. Every ceiling was raised so high, it had to be impossible for a second story to exist. There were no doorways between rooms, but the absence of a wall where one should be. The walls themselves contained no color, only a deep, rich black, or at least it appeared that way. The only form of light was a small spattering of candles and a few skylights. And there were statues everywhere. I looked back at her. Perhaps it was her clothing, how it matched the drapes along the walls, or the curl of her back matching the menace of the statues around us, or even her melancholy spirit, but I knew this woman belonged here. I also knew that I was not going to receive any further information from her while she continued to cry about as she did. "May I have a tour of your unique home?" Rather than give a simple response, she uncurled her body and made a grand gesture, spreading her arms out wide, twisting slightly from side to side, indicating to the walls around us. I stood and gave a slight bow as she returned to her handkerchief. I made a grab for a nearby candle, and around the corner I turned. As I entered the next room, the first thing which caught my attention was a large portrait of Mrs. Creed's above the fireplace. Her cries could still be heard, echoing around the open walls, bouncing off and fading away. Well, I wasn't quite sure what exactly I meant to find in this search. I suppose some sign of motive, something I could present back to the attorney. If she had any plans to stay put and spend away her late husband's riches, and why was she not doing so? If this bloodline had truly never been seen by the town, and that the spouses handled all the affairs, then surely announcing his death would not be beneficial, as it would all be too easy for her to maintain a charade that he was still alive. There was a bit of information I was currently unaware of, and that was, why does the bloodline never want to be seen? It occurred to me that I was uncertain what purpose the room I stood in held. There was space enough for it to be a living room, but there was no furniture, no seats, cushions or tables. It was as if the room was dedicated solely to this painting of its mistress. All that and these bizarre statues. I decided to take a closer inspection, holding the candle up, its shine reflecting off of the smooth stone. The creature was carved in a crouching position, as if ready to pounce. It had a body similar to a man, with claws and horns instead of ears. I could see no indication of fur or any hair on the beast, yet its skin seemed rough and coarse. Protruding from its mouth were large fangs, so engrossed with detail that drips of saliva clung to its gums. But its eyes held the most detail. I'm unsure how the sculpture captured it, but those eyes seemed almost bloodshot. The tiniest suggestion of veins ran through them, and those cat-like pupils were too wide to imply that this creature was looking in only one direction. A shiver ran down my spine as I pulled back. I entered another room before doing a double take and wondered, in that moment, if I'd become confused and somehow wandered back into the same room. But no, this new place was simply identical to the first, albeit with some minor details. There was another painting looming over the room, again of only Mrs. Creed's. She was in a different outfit than the last, surrounded by various plants, and there, in the corner, stood another statued creature. A different pose and slightly different build, but the exact same energy and detail. Rubbing at my eyes, I decided to give one last room a chance before heading back. I was less surprised by what I saw. No furniture, no tables, no cushions, or really any indication that someone comfortably lived here at all. Just another room dedicated to a painting and a statue. Some part of me did become irritated, not even by the lack of evidence, well, the lack of anything really, but the hubris of it all. This large mansion which ruled over the land, and this was all that lay inside it. A dining room and these apparent shrines. If there was something suspect in any of the rooms I hadn't seen, you'd have to wait for another day, I decided, as the final wick of my candle was about to flicker away. I rushed back to where Mrs. Creed's had not moved. "Beautiful portraits," I said, startling her. I cleared my throat as a means of apology. "May I ask who painted them?" It was a thin thread at best. If this family, these Creeds, were so concerned with privacy that they had their spouses imported, I sincerely doubted they'd do any less for their artists. But still, there had to have been someone else I could talk to, and with any luck, someone within a day's journey. "Mrs. Barclay," she answered, not turning to meet my gaze. "My husband commissioned her to paint them during the months we'd been apart. She lives down by the river with her daughter." Well, astonishment washed over me. A local? I decided not to push my luck, thanked her for having me, and attempted to make my way out. However, Mrs. Creed's turned to look up at me. Her head tilted slightly, and her stare burned into me. It was as if, for the first time since I'd arrived, she was truly seeing me. Her lips curled. "What did you say your name was?" Her jaw barely moved as she spoke the words, and they came out slow and syrupy. I gulped. She had yet to blink. In that moment I was back in that swamp. Sweat dripped down my neck, and I saw that predator leer in at me. I'd waited there long, too long, allowed far too much time for this creature to make its way over to me, until finally the instincts to run kicked in. "Shadows," I answered, seeing no alternative. She did not nod or make any sounds of acknowledgement. She simply pressed her lips together and tightened that unwavering grin. "Lovely name," she replied at last, lovely eyes. I saw myself out. Don't know what I expected to happen, but I told myself that I had a new goal to achieve. Find this local artist and ask what they knew about this strange affair. At first impressions, this family was definitely odd. Mrs. Creed's was also odd, in a way that blended in perfectly. I thought over our conversation and realized with disappointment just how little I'd been able to collect. All she'd really mentioned was her husband and her wedding. She wore her qualifications into this family like a badge of honor. Something didn't fit, though. If ever there had been a situation made perfectly for a homicidal spouse, it would be this setup. Had she announced his death in order to move everything into her name? But why invite the suspect? There weren't even any servants in the house to go about town spreading rumors. Mrs. Creed was alone, surrounded by paintings of herself and those horrible statues. The statues. Those were another cause of question. Perhaps they'd been imported gifts, something she'd presented to her husband as he presented her with portraits. Or maybe, if luck was on my side at all, the painter I was going to meet would know more about those as well. What struck me as most intriguing, however, was the fact that Mr. Creed had commissioned the paintings. The painter potentially knew more about him than even his attorney, or at least had interacted with him more. Well, it was worth a shot. I had nothing else to go on after all. Part 3. Not that far from the manor, I managed to find a small cottage along the riverbank. I knocked on the door and a young lady answered. She introduced herself as the daughter of the named Mrs. Barclay and let me in at my behest. "I'm assuming you're here in regards to the paintings?" she inquired, turning into the kitchen and pulling a boiling pot off of the stove. "I'm not the first to be asking then," I replied. She did not respond, so I cleared my throat. "I suppose her artwork is all upstairs?" That did get her attention. "Pardon?" "The walls," I continued, pointing around. "I don't see any paintings put up on them." Well, the look she gave me was caught between confusion and insult. Without turning to look down, she backed into a drawer and produced a small, rather dull-looking knife. "We can't afford to keep those paintings." She began cutting up a loaf of bread, spreading on it a margin of butter, what I suspected was their most luxurious possession. I'd expected her to hand me a slice, but she shoved one into her mouth and headed to the back door with the other. "Mother's outside. I'll go get her." While left alone, I started to survey my surroundings. Aside from the upstairs, I saw the entirety of the cottage in one look. Next to the stove sat a humble table with no seats, although I suspected the chairs sitting in front of the fireplace were multi-purpose. A basket of yarn lay in the corner, and that about covered everything. In comparison to the giant manor which wasted so much space, I found this small home a thing of comfort. It had been, thus far, the warmest part of the town I'd seen. I wondered if every humble house of this town was similar. All the colour and life kept inside, hidden from the inky creature which ate the sun. The back door opened, and in walked a fragile woman, much older than I would have anticipated. She stood barely 4 foot hunched over, walking with a limp. The pocket in the middle of her apron sat full and heavy. Her daughter held on to one hand, the other wrapped around her back. She sat her down into the seat nearest her and pulled the slice of bread from her pocket. I stood there dumbly for a minute, unsure if I should wait for her to finish eating. No one had invited me to sit down, but I wanted it to be known that I was not here for an idle chat. "Mrs. Barclay, I appreciate you seeing me on such—" Her daughter took hold of her mother's free hand, making motions with her own into the palm. Excuse me, but—" I started, and she gave me that same confused and insulted look. "I would rather speak to your mother alone on this matter." "My mother is blind and deaf," she answered shortly without an apology. I nodded, turning my face down, unable to look at her. I didn't want to ask how she managed the life of a painter in her condition. I knew there were many solutions. She might not have been born this way and developed a technique with muscle memory, and besides, it answered the question as to why a man who never wanted to be seen had contacted this particular painter. Well then, anyway, yes, I'm here to discuss the paintings you did of Mrs. Creed's. Do you know her at all? Mrs. Barclay sat there as her daughter translated, and then she gingerly lifted her own fingers, moving them much slower yet more gracefully as she spoke her response. Mother says she's never met with the newest edition of that family. Mr. Creed's wrote her description in great detail, and my mother was able to satisfy his request. I nodded. It is to my understanding that the Creed's bloodline allows their spouses to perform many public duties. I'm interested to know what the interactions with Mr. Creed's entailed. A scoff escaped from the daughter, the first time I saw a smile on her face. Sir, you truly overestimate. But she stopped, looking down at her mother, as did I. She moved her hands around, weaving a story. She says, the daughter started, that it was very foolish of him to have unapproved contact with the outside world, but he so desperately missed his wife that it could not be helped, and now he's paid the consequences for it. What are you saying? I asked, choosing my words carefully. That he died simply from speaking with you? The Creed's bloodline don't leave that house, the daughter said, speaking in general and not as translation for her mother. But Mrs. Creed said that they were married in her country. Yes, but that was approved contact. They were inviting an already trusted family into theirs. I paused, unsure of how to proceed. This all made very little sense to me, but everyone was discussing it as though it was a natural occurrence. The fact that a husband missing his wife had contacted a painter to recreate her portrait was the anomaly, showed me how detached from reality the townsfolk were. But why? Why does that bloodline never want to be seen? Well, I asked as much, and the daughter shrugged, mumbled a word or two about a curse, and left it at that. It was curious to me how open she'd been to stating the terms of the situation without understanding the reasoning behind it, which was something we had in common. It hit me then how there were 4 perspectives. Mrs. Creed, who said her husband died of a family disease. Mrs. Barclay, who essentially said he died of a curse. The attorney, who said he was murdered, and me, who was still trying to decipher the truth. Perhaps this was all an unhappy coincidence. Maybe she really was in love with her husband, and he died prematurely. Maybe the family disease was heightened outside of protective measures, which he had ignored to contact the painter. The only thing which could be done was to have his body exhumed and re-examined by an unbiased party. However, that was not my level of expertise, and if the attorney had held the kind of authority for such a case, he would have done so by now. There was nothing to prove, and nothing which could be used to prove it. All of the evidence in either direction was purely circumstantial. I realized I had no case. I have, one final question, I said. Mrs. Barclay, do you happen to know about the statues residing inside the Creed's manor? The daughter stared at me, her eyes growing wide. My mother, she blinked, shook her head, and I knew beyond doubt that I was being lied to. My mother's never been inside the manor itself. I stood up, thanked the women for their time, but just as I was about to make my way out, Mrs. Barclay made a new gesture. She flicked at her chin with her pointer finger and thumb, then brought up one hand and let the other move under it. She repeated this action insistently. What's she saying? I asked. She says, the daughter responded, sounding as confused as I was. Shadows. The answer caught me off guard. I tried to think back to our conversation earlier and remembered how my introduction had been cut off. How does she know my name? Mrs. Barclay repeated her actions. Oh, she wants you to beware of the shadows. I stared back at her as if the answers lied in her eyes, and maybe they did. How they burrowed into me, freezing me in my place despite not actually being able to see me. Heat began to rise along the back of my neck, causing my hairs to flare up and sweat to drop. I swallowed hard, but felt nothing in my throat and forced back a cough, thinking briefly that maybe the sound would break this spell. But still, she repeated her actions. "So then, you have nothing," the attorney protested. He had a drink out on his desk and stopped midway through his pour as I explained to him my findings. "The only evidence that she is guilty is your own insistence of her being so," I answered. "Whatever secrets this family may be hiding, it's going to take more than one detective to solve it. We need probable cause, more than just poor timing on the mistress's behalf. Unless there's further evidence of a crime, I must return to other cases." "You've already been paid," he insisted, spilling a bit of his drink as he spun around to face me. A candle on the side table flickered from the gesture, and I became acutely aware of its position. "A mistake on your part, sir," I said with as little menace as possible. Well, he obviously was not impressed. "How about we change the terms of the case?" "The terms?" I was confused, but also intrigued. Not with whatever dealings this man had planned, but with the town itself. I was too unsatisfied with this lack of an answer. "So let's assume that you're right," he went on. "Let's say she didn't kill her husband. What remains a mystery still is, well, how did he die?" "Family disease," I answered automatically. "She told me so. You saw her autopsy." "Yes, but what does that entail?" His eyes began to light up. "No one has ever seen the bloodline of the Creeds. What is this family disease that gives them all an untimely death?" Well, I nodded my head in agreement, certain my own eyes shared that glimmer. Discovering that would require the exhuming of his body. We'd have to determine the exact cause before going forth. "The family graveyard," he declared. "It stretches behind their property. It's guarded from the outside, but if you go to call on the mistress, you should be able to go in, Thompson." "Pardon?" "That's his name, late Mr. Creed's." He took a swig of his drink then. "I'm sure his grave will be furthest from the house. Recent descendants are, you see." I stared at him, a bit unbelieving at how quickly he'd jumped onto the idea of exhuming a deceased client. It was then I began to wonder, what did he have to gain from the mistress being guilty? After all, there were no heirs, no next of kin. If she was disowned from the family name, what became of this estate? Now there may yet be a case to solve. May I ask something?" He seemed genuinely put off by my interruption. "This family, so many secrets. They don't even have a family doctor. They just train their own heirs. They import their spouses. How is it that you've become so involved with them? How do you know the inner workings of their house? In fact, how is it that I have been able to, He raised a hand to silence me. "Solve it, and I'll consider our contract complete." And so, I returned to the manor. I knocked, but there came no answer. Cautiously, I knocked again and waited. With the enormous size of the house, I wondered if she were located where she couldn't hear me. I stood there, wondering over the details. I won't lie, part of me was hoping for something. It sounds terrible, but to hope that someone had been murdered. In my position, this whole trip would have been a colossal waste of time if there was no case. However, it was unfair to keep thinking that way. A man had died of mysterious circumstances. It was up to me to ensure no foul play was at hand. Either Mrs. Creeds was innocent or guilty. The same goes for their attorney, and, if it came down to it, Mrs. Barclay. A voice rang out, not one of panic, but one of contentment. It was singing. I followed the sweet lullaby spilling over like the smell of the town. It led me to the back of the manor where I indeed saw the family graveyard, spread out along the downside of the hill. Next to that, however, stood a smaller structure. Its glass walls allowed every speck of sunlight to infiltrate its inner works. And there, I saw her, dancing around. I approached the greenhouse, made uneasy by the fact that I had to cross paths with the graveyard in order to get there. For a family who produced one heir a generation, there were a bountiful amount of graves. How ancient was this bloodline? Before reaching my destination, I saw it, protruding right at my feet, a brand new gravestone, with the words etched into it. Thompson. But the attorney had assured me he'd be lying much further down the hill than this. Surely such a name was commonplace, especially with a family as secluded as this, unless his grieving widow had placed him as close to the manor as she possibly could. I decided to leave that question for later. At last, I reached the greenhouse, and rather than knock on the door itself, I knocked along the wall where Mrs. Creed's was closest to. She gasped at the sight of me, but then she smiled. The widow approached the door, opening it for me. "It's you again," she exclaimed, her tone as light and playful as the song she'd been singing. She gestured. Come inside." I did as she requested, attempting to keep my shock from becoming obvious. I wanted to dive directly into the reasons for my visit, to keep it as short as possible, but I knew I had to lead into it. I couldn't risk turning her off and shutting down. "What a lovely garden you have," I ventured. "I must say I've never seen plants like this." It was the truth. "No, you wouldn't," she answered, her tone still light and airy. "They are from my hometown. They came along the ship with me." "So, you're a botanist?" Mrs. Creed shrugged. "In a way, I do love plants. They're so useful. So many purposes and functions, so many special properties." "Did the greenhouse exist before your arrival, or was it made especially for you?" Well, this seemed to give her pause. I'd thought it an innocent question enough, but her suspicions had been raised nonetheless. Her good mood had been stilted, ever so slightly. Still, she went along, explaining that the structure had been here long before her time, and that she'd only brought the plants with her. Since she had yet to shove me out, I decided to push my luck. "Mrs. Creed's," I started. She did not look at me, but rather tended to a nearby flower. From the table, she raised a pair of shears and began to cut off the rotted parts of her plant. "I know from your attorney that you performed your husband's autopsy. This family disease, what makes you—" "It goes back for generations," she blunted. The shears clicked in tune with her words. "It's the same one to strike whenever an heir of this family is married." "How does it affect the spouses?" "It doesn't." She placed the shears down then, and turned to me. "They die of a broken heart. How can one hope to live in this world without their soulmate?" Well, I stared at her, but she had that faraway gaze again. "I never had anyone understand me the way that Thompson did. It was as if I had only been half of myself, and he is what made me whole. I am more myself with him than I am alone." I nodded, watching her talk more to herself than me. "Oh, you seem to be in much higher spirits than when I last saw you." "Oh, yes," she said, coming back to the present. I cleared my throat, unsure of how to segue into my questions. "Look, I don't mean to upset you, but the attorney has a few questions regarding the death of your husband." "Yes, I had figured as much," she interrupted, returning to pruning her plant. "I wondered how he'd react to my suddenness. I can't say I blame him. However, the circumstances are quite suspicious, wouldn't you agree? I was going to leave well enough alone, but if he's making a move as to involve someone else, then I had better proceed with caution. I think it would be best for you to see my husband." Well, I felt my jaw go slack at her words. Was she being serious? No, there was no way. Her actions and manner could not have been more opposite than yesterday. What had happened during that time to cause such a reaction? Unless she wants me to figure out what was going on, but I wasn't moving quick enough, so she's given me a clue. She doesn't think I can solve this. She was toying with me. "I appreciate the offer," I managed to say. "I hope you understand, given the circumstances, it would be best for an unbiased third party to come and give your husband another autopsy. I can arrange—" Her chuckle at that moment took me by complete surprise. It had not even been a loud chuckle, but it was still the last thing I'd expected to come from her. "He is not dead," she exclaimed, waving her hand as if I were a child asking if fairy tales were real. "It's only temporary. He shall be back." I paused, unable to speak. How delusional was this woman? "Mrs. Creeds, what do you mean?" "Just as I said." Her bite had returned. "It's only temporary. You should not have risked getting those paintings. You can't blame two people in love, though. He will be back. Then you can ask him for yourself what had happened." "Are you saying you misdiagnosed him in your autopsy? Is that his grave which protrudes the cemetery out there?" "I dug him that grave myself, and he lies in there still, but only for a little while longer, thanks to you." Her last statement bothered me, but I had no intention of showing it. I took notice of what exactly she was doing. The plant which she'd been tending to lay in pieces within a bowl, and she was adding in others, mashing them together, stirring around the contents. "So you're saying that your husband is lying within a coffin beneath the earth? If, for example, I were to dig him up right now, I'd find his corpse within it." "If you must, go right ahead. It would save me the trouble of digging him up later." She did not look away from her work as she said this. "Mrs. Creeds," I went on, my impatience starting to show, "by your own definition, your husband is dead." Well, that got her attention. She placed the bowl down with such force that some of it spilled over onto the table. She turned, but approached slowly, as if allowing me time to rethink my words before she reached me. "Mr. Shadows," she said in a low tone, "no one ever truly dies around here." Well, I did not stay after that. I would return later in the night to see what progress she'd made on apparently digging up her dead husband. Once the body was exhumed, I would find the means to bring it to a legitimate doctor. And only then would she be able to uncover the cause of death and clear her name. Or not. Well, her only goal now was to bring him back. However, there was a strong disconnect from reality that seemed to permeate throughout the town. That alone wasn't evidence that she was a murderer, though. Why does this bloodline not want to be seen? Upon exiting the property, I glanced over at the Thompson tombstone one more time, and noticed a scrawling along the bottom of it. There read only one word, etched in with a hurried hand. Shadows. Was it meant to be my name, or a warning? I looked around the graveyard some more. I read the names along the tombstones, every one bearing the surname Creeds, but I noticed a small detail. Under each name, under each beloved wife or husband, stood the term married into, followed by the year. This graveyard didn't belong to the bloodline. Everyone buried here was one of the spouses. For some reason I thought back to Mrs. Creed's words, "No one ever truly dies around here." They bothered me more than they should have. These people, everyone I'd spoken to, they all knew something. It was in their manner, their almost casual nature about it all. The attorney, for example. The family hides from society, has a genetic disease which kicks in when an heir marries, and the only aspect which seemed unusual to him was the timing. Did he know that this graveyard only held the spouses? Did he know the whereabouts of the deceased bloodline? Oh, they knew. They had to know more. They were toying with me, all of them. Mrs. Barclay may have been trying to warn me about that, but all the same, it meant even she knew more than she was letting on. I had a case to solve. A new surge of inspiration hit me as I returned to the attorney's office. He was lost in a cloud of tobacco smoke, but his spirits were up. "So, how went the latest trip, then?" "Abysmal," I replied, a bit surprised at how comfortable I was becoming with his company. I felt no need to build up what I had come to say. "Mrs. Creeds seems convinced that her husband's death is only temporary, and that he will return." He stopped, putting out his cigar, and came over to where I stood. "I can assure you," he insisted, "Thompson Creeds is dead." "How can you possibly assure me of anything?" I demanded, standing up, facing him in the eye. "What you've been able to give me is an unreliable autopsy and suspicions because there are no other leads. I'm going to ask you something. I will not leave until it's answered." He paused, before finally nodding and allowing me to proceed. "What do you stand to gain in all of this?" I asked. "What does it matter if Mrs. Creeds killed Mr. Creeds? Do you intend to lock her away? This powerful family could be collapsing right in front of you, and rather than do anything concrete, you seem to be more interested in allowing it to proceed. Why?" He took in a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "Mr. Shadows, my family has always served the Creeds. It's always been this way. They rule and we serve. I have nothing against Mrs. Creeds. My loyalty is to the bloodline, which, I promise, is a loyalty I will never cross." I returned that night. Mrs. Creeds was where she said she would be, in the graveyard, digging up her husband. She had made a considerable way. I only caught the top end of her shovel as she flung dirt from over her shoulder. I called out, causing the shovel to disappear as she crawled up. She didn't look even remotely surprised at my presence, even though my manner was far more aggressive. She simply pulled herself from the grave and allowed me to approach. "You are hiding something," I accused, all pretense of professionalism leaving me. As a detective, I acknowledged my actions as irrational, but as a person, my need for answers had reached its peak. "I demand you tell me." She stood there, her jaw set in an almost pouting manner, but her body language juxtaposed. Her arms were at her side, clutching onto the shovel in her dress, pulling it up ever so slightly while she leaned forward, as if expecting to run, as if expecting to pounce. "You asked about my qualifications," she started, speaking every word slowly. "I'm certain you think I'm insane, digging up a grave like this, but that's to be expected. You don't know anything about the bloodline. If you did, this would all seem perfectly rational to you." I let out an exasperated sigh. "Mrs. Creeds, did you kill your husband?" Her eyes went wide. Her calm demeanor vanished as shock took over. "No, heavens, no, of course not. I would only get 18 years with him. I want as much of that time as possible." "So what did he die from?" "Family disease, as I said. Only it's not supposed to happen this early. But anomalies will happen from time to time, even to us, as long as it can be rectified. That's why I had called upon the attorney. I knew he would contact someone from the outside." Contact? She knew that I'd come. Why would you want that? My husband died because he contacted the outside world when he commissioned that painter. It was an anomaly, but it can be reversed with another outsider. It's like how one builds an immunity to poisons. Is that anomaly why you have him buried in the spouse's graveyard? She nodded. I needed to keep him preserved while I worked. I didn't know if my herbal remedy would be enough, but then you came along. All of us spouses are scouted out for any skills which we could bring to the manor. The more practical, the better. But it goes beyond that. To marry into this family, one has to know the shadows in their true form and love them for it. And then, she struck me along the side of the head with the shovel. I tumbled over, my vision shot and my ears ringing. I could vaguely feel my body dragging along the grass, being pulled closer to the open grave. Mrs. Creeds made little grunting sounds as she moved me. I became dizzy from the fall, but the pain in my head numbed the pain my back felt as I hit the dirt. Or at least, the first thing I noticed was the dirt. Then I became aware of the shapes underneath me, the leathery touch of flesh, the hard angles of bone. I began to realize how much larger this shape was compared to me. I felt the large claws wrap around my torso and sink into my skin. I felt the fangs at my neck, and just before my vision faded completely, I looked up to see Mrs. Creeds, staring down with a hopeful look in her eyes. And I acknowledged how familiar this all felt, and that Mrs. Creeds was right. No one ever truly dies here. Shadows' body contorted for a few moments longer, until enough blood had been lost for it to go still. Once all life was gone, he began to feast. Mrs. Creeds was so relieved to see that her husband had a hearty appetite after the ordeal he'd been subjected to. She would be sure to thank their attorney in due time. Afterwards, he crawled out from his tomb, wiping away the last of the blood from his lips. The happy couple stood there, reunited at last in the garden. Mrs. Creeds looked upon her husband and smiled. All the generations wasting away in their home, and yet here he was before her once again, as it should be. They really did belong together. Nothing was more convincing of that than this little reunion tonight. Not many people understood what it meant to love these creatures. Humans could only love so deeply, but the Creed's bloodline, this ancient and powerful family, these shadows, knew love far greater than any person ever could. Still, it was human spouses which they needed, and the families they chose from had a better understanding than most. They knew that this love, that maintaining this family, was worth more than revealing any secrets which needed to be kept. Mr. Creeds pointed at his wife's swelling stomach, which he stroked with affection. "Soon, my love. Soon." Okay, what the hell was that about? Oh, that was a really weird, old-school, Gothic-styled horror story. I haven't done one like that in quite a long time, so delighted to be back to that subgenre of horror. What did you think? Thoughts, feelings, anything else you want to say in the comments section below the video? And as ever, I'll do my best to join in the conversation. Well, that is it for your Monday evening's entertainment. Back again with something else really special on Wednesday. Another hour-long story, I think. So until then, my dear friends, very, very sweet dreams. And bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.